Welcome to the Culture Stew podcast. I'm Maria Marukian.
And I'm Roger Moriano.
In every episode, we will meet with practitioners, authors, and all around fascinating people who share their wisdom and insights on all things related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Hello there, Roger.
Maria, what a great conversation we had with our guest.
Yes, Dr. Carol Parker Walsh. She is the founder and owner of Carol Parker Walsh Consulting. And really fantastic conversation. She brings so much experience and knowledge, not only specifically in the sort of DEI space, but more broadly in terms of human and organizational development. So I loved the way that we were able to kind of thread all of these pieces together. She can go deep, but she can also go broad.
Yeah, and I love that, what we were hoping the conversation would be about was about the human beings at the center of all of these issues, right? And sure enough, she really jumped into having us hear some really important perspectives on how do we grapple with how our identities show up in workplaces and the communities that we're a part of. How do we get folks to engage in conversations around the importance of identity and how we experience these places? And how do we do so in a way that is substantive and can last? And we talked a little bit about how there is resistance to talking about identity in some manners that we're seeing right now in our society. And so really connecting with one another, realizing that at the center of all of this is human beings. We are not robots, that we need to take care of ourselves. She really touched upon all of these things and really had us think a lot about how important it is to revisit these ideas and to get into practices that really take care of the person at the center of the organizations that we're a part of.
And I appreciated that she shared how, she really kind of got her start in law and focusing on labor and employee relations and EEO, and then shared that just she got burnt out focusing on some of those issues, which I can completely understand and empathize with. And then just sort of the pivot to be able to look at this more broadly in terms of where could she provide the most value, the most meaningful support, and how that turned into focusing on leaders, on executives, on women in particular, and being able to really sort of pinpoint what does it take for us to reflect, to own who we are, to, and sometimes to reinvent ourselves if we are at a career crossroads, and looking for what are those, those skills to get us to that next level of whatever success or progress looks like for us. And then just kind of weaving the identity piece, the intersectionality piece into that overall framework, I think is just a profound way of looking at how to do this work in a sustainable way, rather than it being this, we must do DEI, and then it just kind of gets shoved into this corner or put into HR or put into EEO, but instead just seeing it as like, this is just fluid. It's a part of who we are. And what are the day-to-day practices and norms and mindsets that we can bring that can make the biggest cultural shifts in our organizations to support inclusion and belonging.
Yeah, and clearly her comfort level in talking about these issues shows me how clear it is that she spent a lot of time with these subject matters over the years. She has a lot of familiarity with how organizations grapple with these things, and that her own experiences and expertise has really provided her with the tools and the skill set and the knowledge to really benefit so many folks that could benefit from her message and from her knowledge and wisdom.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I hope people will enjoy our conversation with Dr. Carol Parker Walsh, and also hopefully take away the little nuggets of information that she provides and tips that she provides, particularly at the end, talking about wellness and, our health and wellness and well-being. And, one thing that I am definitely taking away is this notion of however you define stress relief, right? That well-being, those well-being practices, do them regularly, schedule them, and keep them as sacred on your calendar. So I am going to make sure that I hold myself accountable for that.
Yes.
All right, everyone, enjoy our conversation with Dr. Parker Walsh. Welcome, Dr. Carol Parker Walsh. Thank you so much for joining us on the Culture Stew podcast today.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
So tell us a little bit about your backstory, and in particular, what are some messages that you remember getting early in life that have really had a significant impact on your identity, have shaped your sense of who you are, how you show up in the world?
Yeah, well, a little bit about my, kind of professional backstory. I started my career as a labor and employment attorney, and focused on employment discrimination litigation and plaintiffs' work and contract work and labor negotiations and agreements. So I've always been, an advocate for employees and, the fact that we spend the majority of our time at work and feeling like it should be an enjoyable experience. And I felt that 30 years ago when I became a lawyer, even today in the work that I do. And after I transitioned out of practicing, I was an HR director for a moment, and then transitioned more to doing organizational consulting, really from the lens of helping organizations not get sued was the first kind of lens in which I took to do that work. But as I continued my own education and got my doctorate in human development and social systems and organizational systems, I really started looking more at the human in the organization, kind of the human capital and how we show up, how we define who we are, how we structure our identity, and how that informs the work that we do, and how organizations can be more people centric and more people forward focused in terms of the work that they do, and really help supporting in that regard. And then I continued on after I got my doctorate and started teaching actually leaders and leadership development, directed a couple of graduate academic programs, and became an associate dean before I launched my own practice 10 years ago. And that's what I've been doing since, is my own work. But this is in line with the messages that influenced me as I was growing up. My father was a feminist, although obviously at the time I didn't define it as that as I was growing up, or didn't really know what that is. So in retrospect, I really see he was a feminist because he was a strong catalyst in terms of informing me with the idea and the proposition that there was nothing out of my reach, there was nothing I couldn't do, there was nothing I couldn't inspire to do when I set my mind to it. And so, and just having a curiosity around things and the possibility of things. So I really appreciate that from what he's done for me. He always told me anytime I accomplished something, or every time I got a degree before he passed, he would always ask the question, "So what are you going to do with that?" And I remember early on, I thought, get a job. I don't know, what else would you do? But as I've gotten older, I continue to ask myself the question, what are you going to do with that? Now, what are you going to do? Now, what's the impact you're going to make? What's the contributions that you want to leave? What's the work that you want to be most proud of and do in the world, right? What are the populations that you want to really support and advance and elevate and uplift? So that question always is in my head from my father asking, what are you going to do with it? Because it felt like I had a responsibility now that I gained this knowledge or information or whatever it is that I was able to accomplish, that from that perspective, it felt like, okay, now what are you going to give back with it? What are you going to contribute with that? And so that's always been a big influence for me. And I think it's informed a lot of the decisions I made in my career as well.
Well, and it's a career that led to, engaging organizations and communities and cultures around issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, particularly when it comes to leadership and strategy and innovation. And so, how has that been for you, engaging in that work? And have you seen, that those topics, those areas evolving in your work as you've done it for some time?
Yeah, absolutely. I used to do much more diversity or DEI focused work, I think the way most people think about it, for a lot of years. And to be honest with you, I got burnt out and stopped doing it because I wasn't seeing the impact that I was hoping would be made, the behavioral changes, the widening of perspectives, and people really not just checking the box around DEI work, but actually engaging it and really wrestling with what does it mean to create an environment that's inclusive and really has an opportunity for people to feel like they belong. And I felt for a long time I was beating my head up against the wall. So I kind of walked away from it, and I had to approach it or think about it from a different perspective to be able to come back to it. And for me, it's all about humanity. It's all about really finding that common ground and where we can find those connections and starting from that place. It felt before that what the way I was doing diversity, or at least the way it seemed to be done, was that it was starting with you're different, I'm different. Now put us in a room and let's see what happens, right? Um, as opposed to starting from a place of, at our baseline, we're both human. At our baseline, we're working in this environment. Our baseline, we have struggles, we have our identities, we have so many things that align us more than divide us. So if we can start there and find those connections and build a sense of trust and community around that and grace around that, then we can elevate and have the conversation around where are the areas in which we're different. Because at that point, it becomes a curiosity more than it becomes a form of divisiveness or difference. So for me, the work, the way it's kind of progressed throughout the years that I've been doing it has really been focused around that kind of premise. And I think in a lot of ways, I think a lot of I'm seeing more of that type of conversation in the DEI space moving forward than maybe what we were doing before. And I think right now, when you're talking about mental health issues and well-being, I think that is what's being a catalyst and having us kind of turn that conversation a little bit better when we think about safe spaces to have this conversation. So I'm excited about that, and I think it's a smart thing to do, because I think not only do we have to think about the well-being of the people in the organization, we have to think about the well-being of the people who are the practitioners who are bringing this in the organization as well.
Yes to that. I think we definitely, I'd like to explore that question of well-being, because that's something that we've been talking about a lot on the show and just in our own team and with our colleagues, the incredibly high level of fatigue and burnout that a lot of people who are in this space of DEI, social justice, are facing. Before we get there, though, I wanted to come back to something you were saying, Carol, and I know that you got your doctorate in human and organizational development. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that intersection, or how you have been able to kind of apply DEI as more of a strategic lens that accompanies organizational development principles and that sort of basic understanding and care about humans, right? So that it doesn't feel as though it's this separate thing that we must
Mhm.
do, but that it also isn't perceived as uh, as this. I think a lot of people are getting caught up in this misconception that it is meant to be divisive and to focus on our differences. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what are some of the model practices or ways in which you have been able to help organizations navigate that challenge of often sort of pushing DEI to the side, and really taking more of that integrated approach.
Yeah, that's a great question. In terms of the intersectionality, I always operate from that lens of intersectionality, because we are always all operating at that intersection. One of the things that Patricia Hill Collins, who wrote a book called Black Feminist Thought years ago, talked about, that there's no pure victims on the matrix of oppression, that we all, at maybe different stages and places in our life and experience, may be at the top of the food chain or not, right? Whether it's ableism, whether it's age, whether it's education, whether it's socioeconomic, that we move. There's some areas, as a woman of color, I tend not to be on the higher end as woman and an African American, but as from in terms of education, in terms of ability, you're right. In terms of so many other areas, I see a lens through the majority perspective, as opposed to seeing a lens most often through individuals who may have some ableism challenges, or or other, the isms on that matrix of oppression, if you will. So for me, and a lot of the work that I do a lot of work with women in particular, and I'm always, coaching and having conversations around the intersection around age, gender, race, and sometimes, the socioeconomic as well. So when you understand through my education around human development and identity development in particular, you have to take in the multiplicity of identities and always remember that you're not just talking to one monolithic group, or when you are speaking, you're speaking to only a piece of someone, but not all of someone. And so you have to always be thinking about that. And for me, from an organizational perspective, the best way to handle that is to start with a team of people that speak to these different intersections, right? That because some people identify more strongly with one identity or at one level of that intersection than they do the other. It sometimes it depends contextually where they are. I remembered, like, I've lived all over the country, and I remember having this conversation years ago. And I know when I lived in Chicago or Baltimore or Atlanta, my gender presented more than my race because it was a more diverse cultural areas. But when I moved to the Pacific Northwest, all of a sudden my race presented more than my gender. And so having to navigate spaces through that different intersection is very different. So what I think is a good strategy, or what we've done, is to try to start with a group and a team of individuals that represent different intersections, right? I know we all have them, but still people who maybe identify more, that are leading more with one of their identities, and bringing a group together and then doing some work with the group and then allowing them to integrate the work in their day-to-day activity, so that it's not a let's all go to a training, okay, now let's go back to work, or let's have a conversation and dialogue but then go back to work. But instead, is how do we embed it into our daily practice? How do we hold staff meetings where we're thinking about these issues? How are we greeting people? How are we making sure that everyone's heard in the meeting? How are we thinking about making sure that, people are able to express themselves with candor and creativity within that space? When we're rolling out policies, how do we stop and think about, okay, how is this policy going to impact people at those different intersections, right? And because I know I come from one lens, I think it's always best to have that kind of collaborative work group or that collaborative group of people that you can bounce things off of, because I'm going to see things through my lens in the way that somebody else may not see them through theirs. So having a group of people, working on certain issues that are related to the day-to-day practices of the organization, just so that there's feedback and conversation, but also in the day-to-day conversations and rollout and implementation, continually thinking about those things and having those conversations, to me, is the way to embed it into organizational practice and to actually see behavioral change, as opposed to making it a separate activity. If I'm making sense with that.
It reminds me of a great book that I read, and I can't remember the names of the authors right now, but it's called Inclusion Nudges. And it's just
Mm,
exactly what you're talking about, right? That when we can integrate these small but not insignificant, right, day-to-day practices that just become the part of who we are and how we are, right? Those behavioral
yes.
norms. And rather than it being this seemingly overwhelming and insurmountable, challenge to overcome, it's what are the small things that we can be doing on a day-to-day basis. I just saw a study that came out, I think it was the Gallup organization, that looked at um, the the amount of appreciation that employees get, and this is on a global scale, right? When people feel as though they are getting adequate and authentic appreciation from their leaders and managers, they are more likely to not only be engaged and to have a
Mhm.
positive level of satisfaction in the organization, but they also rate the organization higher in terms of its inclusiveness and equity. And
Yes.
the ratings were even more significant for women and racially and ethnically minoritized individuals, because when we feel valued, right? Especially if we're coming from minoritized identity groups, we're more likely to have trust and that level of engagement in the organization. And it's like, it doesn't take a lot to just
That
tell somebody you appreciate them for doing the making the extra effort, and making it genuine, not like, how many times do I have to tell somebody good job? It's got to be something that we are being
yes.
intentional about, but it can make such a huge difference in the organizational culture.
I completely agree with that. I completely agree with that, and I think and even to move the thing about doing inclusion, belonging, diversity work, it is not an overnight proposition. I think the idea people have this idea that, well, now that we've done the training, we're all diverse and
Yes.
inclusive, or now
Come in,
that we
DEI fairy, wave your magic wand and
exactly,
fix everything for us.
exactly. Now that we had the conversation, aren't we better? It is a continual process. It is in the small little moments that change takes place. And if we continue just to make those small little efforts at every turn, then we can actually start to create a culture where it becomes common practice and we don't even have to think about it. And that's why I love the work around psychological safety, Amy Edmondson's work around that, because I think it's so powerful to create the groundwork for us to have conversations so that if something does come up, someone else in the room can say, "Hey, did you consider blah, 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 blah?" Without someone feeling defensive or feeling judged. It's just an ability to have a conversation because we created a space where we can all voice our opinions and our thoughts so that we can make the environment such a better place, right? And when I feel heard, when I can say that and you say, wow, I didn't even think about that. Thank you so much for bringing that up. That's some great insight. I feel seen, heard, appreciated, and valued. And of course, I'm going to participate more because I see that this is an organization where they see and value what I have to bring to the table.
Well, and that's so important because, as you said, when you feel seen and heard, because the practices within an organization or a community become the norm, and people are engaging in these conversations and asking these questions, it allows that space for folks to have their lived experiences, their perspectives, their actual valid ways of experiencing the world heard and seen. And that includes in the intersectional ways that those show up, right? All the multitude of identities that make up who we are. We give that a better
Hmm.
chance of actually being seen within organizations. And that's crucial. It's really crucial because we are living in a time also, we're seeing a surge, with the anti-wokeness movement and all these things, we're seeing a surge of folks really insisting upon not seeing color, for example, right? That we must be colorblind because by seeing color, we are sabotaging our efforts, right? We're creating a situation where we're going to move backwards. And, I think we can all probably appreciate the intentions behind that you want to just see the human being. But when you automatically close off an aspect of their identity, you're doing the opposite, right? You're creating a space that's not feeling like it could be safe, that you can have yourself be seen or heard. So, in these practices, in creating organizations or encouraging organizations to show up this way, what are ways that you have encouraged leaders of organizations to create that type of culture? And have you experienced resistance to that? Have you experienced successes? How have organizational leaders been open to or not open to creating a culture where these everyday practices are the norm so we can really connect with one another?
Yeah, for me, it starts with self. Most everything starts with the ability for you to be able to feel comfortable enough to show up as your authentic self, right? To your point of being colorblind, like when I look in the mirror, I see color every day. So I don't know if people are missing when they see me. But and so we have to embrace our own identity and feel confident and comfortable to show up in that space authentically. And there's so many leaders that I talk to who leave so much at home, right? Who don't bring that piece of themselves to the work. I did a TED talk, and the question that I asked came from an article that I saw in a diversity magazine probably decades ago, and it asked the question, "What did you leave behind when you came to work today?" And it gave an entire list of things like your yarmulke, your accent, your cross necklace, your natural hair, just a number of things that they listed, and it took me aback because I thought, wow, it made me stop to think. How am I not showing up as my full self because I'm worried I'll be judged or not accepted, or I don't want to intimidate anyone or offend anyone or things of that nature? So if we can't start that process for ourselves to be able to feel confident enough to show up authentically in a space, and hopefully an organization that will embrace that, it'll be hard to be able to create a place of inclusion for other people because you can't do it for yourself. So one of the things that I love to work on with leaders is around how do you show up authentically? How do you connect and merge all those pieces of yourself and let that fabulousness show up, in the workplace? But yes, there is resistance to it. Unfortunately, I think the affirmative action decision, we saw a massive surge and push toward DEI work after George Floyd. And then we saw the affirmative action decision just roll it back. I've had conversation after conversation with leaders in various organizations where they have said they're pulling back their efforts, that once this program that they once had is no more, or now it's open to everyone, it's not just for, the population that it was initially designed to promote and support within the organization. So they're pulling back on this effort. And so the resistance I see is fear around that decision and what it will mean if they were to get sued. But I also think for people who just weren't vested in it and just didn't really believe that it was something that mattered or was important, the decision was utilized as an excuse to not do something they weren't even vested in doing before. So, yeah, I do see resistance to it right now more than ever because of the affirmative action decision that came out.
It's interesting to me. So I kind of wanted to touch on two things you said. The rolling back. I was just at a conference with a number of DEI leaders, corporate leaders, and one of the things that they kept repeating and reinforcing in the panel discussions was um, the Supreme Court affirmative action case should have no effect on your organization's policies and practices. These are two separate things. And so, that kept sort of reinforcing that to, I think to some extent, reinvigorate these DEI professionals and give them the language to be able to go back to their leadership and say, no, 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 this is not, these are apples and oranges. And, quotas have never been legal, and discrimination has never, well, at least not since not since certain laws were put into place, has never been legal. So this is, this should have no impact. And if it is having an impact, it's because you're not necessarily focusing on the right practices and policies. And
Hmm.
so I thought that was really interesting just to kind of hear that that's something that a lot of organizations are struggling with, that this this verdict came out and it had such a powerful chilling effect on corporations and nonprofit entities.
Well, there was a letter that went out in certain states by the attorney generals,
Well,
in
yeah.
certain states that went out to corporations CEOs saying, stop it, don't do it. And if you do, we will prosecute you. So that put a lot of fear in organizations, and particularly organizations, if they're doing any work with governmental contracts, if they have internal risk management people, they're also seeing that that's the inroad into from that decision, and if they're dealing at all with a governmental entity, that is where that decision is having some far-reaching consequences. So,
Yeah.
it really depends on the conversations that's happening in the organization. With their risk management team, with their attorneys, with the CEOs, and how they're interpreting it. But I agree with you. When it first came out, I kept telling people that the decision was for universities that were getting governmental funding. It was not for every organization out there in the world. And so, why they're even bringing up, I could see them having the initial conversation and checking their books or their records, or who are some of their stakeholders and clients are. But it's not something that has to shift what they're doing, right? And it should give them, to your point, an opportunity to be more thoughtful about the things that they are doing within the organization, as
Yeah.
opposed to pulling back on practices that maybe they were starting to, or initiatives that they, rolled out over the last few years.
And so much of it comes back to what you were mentioning earlier, Carol, about fear, right? And I think about that not only in terms of how leaders are reacting more on a broader scale to DEI as a strategic framework and in terms of these systemic initiatives, but also even just to the notion of coaching, because you mentioned earlier how this work needs to start with self-reflection and understanding ourselves. And I have been not surprised, but I'll have to be honest, disappointed with how many times I have brought up the concept, the idea of coaching for executives with whom we work on these, broad scale initiatives, and there is such a lack of appetite for it. And I think it does come back to this notion of fear that the perception is coaching, whether it's coaching just more broadly for effectiveness as an executive or coaching with more of a specific focus on what's my role as a DEI champion and ally. That underlying sense of fear often arises in terms of, oh, well, no, I don't need coaching. That's like remedial, right? That's if there were trouble or I were underperforming, rather than seeing it as the incredible developmental tool that it is. And so I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit, Carol, to your work as a coach and how have you seen that resistance to coaching perhaps manifest among leaders, and how do you sort of overcome that to get leaders to a place where they are open to the notion of that ongoing self-reflection and development?
Yeah, so the first thing is that I love analogies, and if you've ever watched the movie The Matrix, there's a line where Morpheus says, "Every mind can't be freed." So I have learned over the years that I start with a willing participant. For me, and this is again going back to health and well-being, in terms of where I work and where I, am doing my most engagement. So I have to preface what I'm saying with that. But I think the other thing is that that's a very old school way of thinking about coaching. And coaching in the past, decades ago, if somebody were getting a coach, it was because it was a performance issue and it was a problem. So it meant that this was some type of corrective action because maybe you weren't succeeding in the right way. But for me, what I've seen shift and what is going to make a shift is this whole generational shift that's happening in the workplace. The transition of, like, right now there are more millennials in the workplace than any other population, even though boomers and Gen X are still in positions of power and authority. And in 2025, 75% of the workforce is going to be millennials. And as we continue to move, and millennials and Gen Zs who are right behind them are very much into diversity, inclusion, and belonging. So we're going to reach a a pivot point in which this is no longer going to be a conversation of should we, can we, how can we? And it's going to be we need to get this done because we're losing people, they're not staying. We're espousing this value of inclusion and belonging, but they're not feeling it when they're here. And so our reputation is going to suffer, our productivity is going to suffer, our engagement, and on and on and on because of that shift, which is, I think we are right in the middle of this. We're right on the precipice of this, I think, making a difference when we start having a generational shift into leadership. So what I often say to leaders is that get ready or get ran over because it's coming. The numbers don't lie. The population is shifting. And if you want to have a reputation in the workforce of people that are in there saying, no, they are walking their talk. They are having this conversation. I see them showing up authentically and changing as a leader and giving me space to be able to do the same. Right. And so that's one of the biggest things I present leaders with is that if you're trying to build a pipeline of leaders that are going to be leading as your existing leadership retires, If you want an organization that in the community has a reputation that people love to work there and they feel engaged because authenticity and vulnerability and mental health issues, which are at the highest point right now for individuals in the workplace, that someone can say, yes, we can check those boxes off at that organization, then you need to get with the program or you are going to get left behind or ran over. And so that's the conversation I have with leaders, is that when we're talking about the future of work, when we're talking about longevity, that this may not feel good for you now, but if you want a sustainable business in the future, then let's talk about some ways in which we can give you the support you need to be able to position not only yourself, but your organization for sustainability as you move forward.
Yeah, and God bless, Gen Z and millennials for pushing for these initiatives, right? I think that the issues of mental health and burnout and those kind of matters, I think, have affected all generations for a long, long time. We're finally getting to a point where folks are insisting upon creating workspaces and communities that are paying attention and really seeing the whole human being, right? And in the middle of all the
Oh
intersections of our
yeah.
identities is a human being, right? That wants to
Yeah,
live well and be well,
our generation sucked it up and had a stroke.
right?
Or retired early or had a
Hmm.
mental breakdown, right? Which clearly the generation following us looked at us like, are we crazy? Like, I'm not going to do that. And so there's been so many examples of them raising their hand saying, no. I mean, it shocked the world when Simone Biles said, I'm not going to perform at the Olympics, but I'm not feeling it. I'm just not in the place to do it. Or when
Right.
Naomi Osaka was like, no, I'm not going to interview and I'm going to take a break because I'm a little overwhelmed right now. And that's more important to me than winning, than getting the gold. I know I made the commitment to show up, but what's more important to me than performing is my health. That is a construct that our older generations, boomers, Xers, that was not how we were raised. We were raised that you show up, you commit, you are there until you die. And even that shift is one of the things that is reinforcing this idea around how are you creating spaces of inclusion and belonging, where I feel that if I'm not up to the task today, I'm not going to be penalized, ostracized, demoted, or put out of or told that somehow or other I don't have work ethic or I'm not showing up in the way that I should. So those generations bringing this conversation to the forefront is really going to, I think, help advance and even re-articulate in some ways our ideas of what it truly means to be inclusive and to have a belonging environment.
Yeah, well, amen to that. And I think that every generation will benefit from that world once we get there. And I know we're heading in that direction. And I'm curious, because so many of us that do this work as well have to worry about our own self-care, right? And our own well-being in the middle of all of this. So could you share some either strategies or practices that you engage in that allows you to kind of take care of yourself as well to make sure that you are able to sustain yourself in the work and not burn out?
Absolutely. I think there's three important things that anyone is doing this work must avail themselves of. And that's first, you want to have a community of support. You want to have other people who are in the trenches that you can have conversations with so that you don't feel crazy. Because sometimes you can go in organizations and try to do this work and feel gaslighted or feel like, is it me? And to have other practitioners or people that you can talk to is so incredibly helpful. And not only can you share best practices, but you have this level of support from people who understand what you're going through. I think the other thing is to get your own coach. One of the things that I invested in was having a health and wellness coach for myself and someone who could just help me around my own mindset and my own well-being in terms of, am I getting enough sleep? Am I eating right? Am I taking care of myself in ways that I should? And to have someone that can have that accountability, that I can have that accountability for, to help me to think about making sure that I'm thinking about myself and my well-being, I think is really important and has been a life changer in that regard. And I recommend that, highly recommend that to anyone doing this work, is to have your own personal coach that can help you with your own mental health and well-being. And I think the other thing is, however you define your stress relief activity, engage in that as much as possible. Get it on the calendar, schedule it, don't fit it in, but schedule it like you would schedule any other session or meeting. So if that's a massage, if that's a hike, if that is swimming, if that is shopping, if that is, whatever it is that will alleviate some stress and give you some opportunity and time to just kind of decompress, whatever that is for you, get that on your calendar and schedule it. And don't just try to fit it in, or hopefully one day you'll get to it, but make it a reality and a part of your practice like any other thing that you're doing.
I say all of the above to those activities for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
That's so helpful. I really appreciate what you were saying just now, Carol, about not only doing it regularly, but actually scheduling it and blocking the calendar and treating it like you do any other sort of work-related meeting or engagement or obligation, right? This is a part of the work. Yeah.
Yes, it
Because I
absolutely is
think,
part of the work.
yeah, I mean, I can speak for my own self. Yes, absolutely. I block those times off, and they're the first things that I take off the calendar and open up for other to-dos, because I don't treat them as sacred. And
Yeah,
that
yeah.
slowly winnows away until I'm not engaging in those behaviors at all, when, I had this great plan and I had this time blocked out, and then I just got rid of it because I'm not taking care of I'm not thinking about taking care of myself as important as all of these other obligations, right? And I think so
Yeah.
many of us do that, where we engage in this continuous self-sacrifice. And I remember reading a book called Resonant Leadership, and Richard Boyatzis and Annie McKee, the authors, talk about the sacrifice syndrome, and how many even very emotionally intelligent, effective leaders run themselves into the ground, and by engaging in this sacrifice syndrome, right? Where we let go of our own needs, we put them down and down and down in order to take care of others, to such an extent that we actually lose our ability to be effective as leaders.
Yeah, that is so true. I was speaking at a conference yesterday, and we got into this conversation about mental health and well-being, and one of the leaders in the audience asked, like, well, what are some of the things that we could do to really help with well-being? And I said it could be, and this goes back to what we said earlier, that sometimes these changes are so simple that we make them more complicated than what they need to be. And one of the things I suggested was that whenever you have your team meetings or you're meeting with people, let one of the things on the agenda or one of the items be, how are you taking care of yourself? Right? What are the things that you're doing, to relax and to make sure that you are operating at your highest capacity? Because not only does it give people an opportunity, well, for you as a leader to see if people aren't doing any of that, and maybe you can encourage that. But it also allows people to share maybe what they're doing, so people can get other ideas around what they can do for themselves. And it reinforces the message that we care about your well-being and mental health, that we think that's just as important as, did you make this deadline? Did you turn this in? What's your attendance rate, or all whatever the case may
Yeah.
be in terms of what the conversation is. But to add that as an agenda item all the time is, how are you taking care of yourself?
I love that. And there's almost this implicit reminder of, I don't want to say accountability or obligation, right? But there is a need sometimes for us to, if we say it out loud, if we're explicit about, this is something that we collectively want to make a priority, we then individually are more committed to doing it. I know I have an accountability buddy when it comes to my own self-care and well-being, and vice versa, right? We text each other often, like, did you do that thing that you were supposed to do? No.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
not
yeah,
to chastise each other, but just to say, hey, I'm looking out for you, and I know you're looking out for me too. And there's that wonderful trust, that I think can help us to make those practices actual habits. Yeah.
exactly, exactly. And that is not taking anything away, but it helps to foster the environment in which we're thinking about you from at least from a mental health and well-being perspective.
Mm,
And even to some of the things we talked about earlier, there's little things that you can just implement on a daily basis in just the conversations down the hall, in the meeting that you're having, in the team retreat or the work group retreat that's happening, where you can embed different practices and different ways of having conversations that expands on these points. I mean, creating inclusion and belonging is just that. It's a verb. It's creating.
mhm.
And so you do it in the little moments of engagement that you're having that makes the biggest difference.
Yeah. So, Carol, what would you like to leave our listeners with today? Is there a call to action or sort of a reminder if there were one thing that you want people to walk away with as a result of our conversation?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think fundamentally, I want to say that we're all in this together. That
I like that.
more that we can have a greater sense of ourself and awareness that allows us to show up fully. And the more that we can give others space to do the same and engage and understand their perspectives, the more that we can kind of grow in the ability to have these kind of conversations and dialogues and ways to support each other and be in this together. Because
Mm,
fundamentally, we are all in this together. We'll find those commonalities that we can grow and move from. But, in the end, there's no winner or loser. Like, it's either we all win or we all lose, because this impacts us all, whether we see it or not, or maybe indirectly or directly. But we're all in this together. And so, since we are in it together, let's find the pathway to make sure that we all are moving in the right direction, and to use the winning together, if you want to use that word.
beautiful. Thank you so much. I love that we're all in this together. Makes us all feel a little bit less alone, right? So
Sure.
if people are interested in learning more about you, Carol, how can they find you?
Yeah, I think I'm always on LinkedIn, so you can definitely find me on LinkedIn, or if you want to go to my website, I have a blog. There's other information that is there that may be of some use or help, and that's at www.carolparkerwalsh.com. But again, I'm always on LinkedIn, and I love to connect and engage with people there as well.
Wonderful. And we will put more information about Dr. Carol in the show notes. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your wisdom and your stories with us. It has been an absolute pleasure.
Well, thank you for having me. This has been fabulous. Thank you for the work that you do as well.
Thank you for listening to Culture Stew. In a world full of podcasts, we are so grateful that you chose to spend time with us today.
Culture Stew is produced by MSM Global Consulting and hosted by me, Maria Marukian.
And me, Roger Moriano.
Are you interested in learning more about Culture Stew and MSM Global Consulting? Sign up for the Culture Stew newsletter at www.msmglobalconsulting.com and send us your stories or your questions at culturestew@msmglobalconsulting.com.
And remember to please give us a 5-star rating and review on your podcast platform.
See you next time.